They say the American dream was built on open fields, wide skies, and the chance to start again. But hidden deep in the hills of Appalachia, behind rotting doors and broken glass, lies another story, one not of freedom, but of blood, a lineage so bound to itself that it began to collapse inward, twisting flesh and mind, until what remained was something America never wanted to see. They are called by many names, whispered in folklore, and coated in shame. But their story is not myth. It is the record of a family line that refused to look outward, choosing instead to sleep beneath the same roof, in the same bed, for generations. And in that choice, they built a legacy as infamous as it is forgotten. This is not a tale of monsters in the woods or legends told to scare children. This is a chronicle of flesh and bone, of hunger and shame, of the most inbred line in America. The family you are about to meet was not created overnight. They were carved slowly, with each birth chipping away at the memory of what they once were. Poverty pressed down on them like a coffin lid, isolation locked the door, and secrecy nailed it shut. Out there in the hollows and coal towns, survival meant turning inward, and when there was no one left to turn to, blood turned on itself. We are not supposed to look at families like this. To document them is to drag private misery into the light. But that light matters, because what happened in the shadows of America's forgotten towns reveals something about us all. What happens when human beings are left too long at the edges of society, when pride and shame intertwine, and when family becomes both refuge and prison. Tonight, we step into the story of a name whispered like a curse, a bloodline both pitied and feared, their lives tangled in a web of silence and suspicion. You may think you know what you'll see, but nothing prepares you for what lies beyond the front porch of that house. This is not entertainment. This is a wound in the history of America, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The family in question was not born notorious. Once they were simply poor people, like so many who scraped by in the Appalachian foothills. Coal mines had dried up, jobs had vanished, and the soil gave little back. Isolation was not a choice, it was a sentence. Roads rarely led into their valley, and strangers rarely came out. Children grew up knowing only their kin, their worlds measured in the space between a shack's four walls and the tree line beyond, and when boys and girls reached the age when they should have met others, there were none to meet. Love, marriage, family, all of it folded inward, the circle tightening until the blood itself grew heavy. At first the signs were easy to hide, a crooked smile, a strange gait, a voice that seemed too high or too low. But over time, patterns began to carve themselves into the family's flesh, like scars passed from one generation to the next. Neighbors whispered about their eyes, the way they stared just a little too long, or not at all. They spoke of children born silent, or with faces that didn't look quite right. Yet in that valley, few dared to speak aloud what everyone already knew. To call it what it was, to name it, would mean admitting that something unholy had taken root in their midst. America likes to tell itself that its darkest stories belong to other countries, other centuries. But in towns, no one remembers. On dirt roads, no one paves. History hides differently. Here, the sins of survival are woven into family dinners, spoken in dialects no outsider understands. For these people, blood was not just heritage. It was currency. It was what kept the family alive, even as it poisoned them slowly from the inside. There are photographs, yellowed with time, where you can see them gathered together. At first glance, they look like any rural family, barefoot, ragged clothes, hair unkempt, but look longer, and unease creeps in, eyes misaligned, skin pallid, postures bent and uneasy. Something about them feels wrong, like a reflection slightly warped in a broken mirror, and in those images lies proof of what poverty and secrecy had carved, a lineage no longer able to escape itself. They were no longer just a family. They had become a closed system, a cycle feeding endlessly on its own blood. By the middle of the 20th century, their name was already spoken in low voices beyond the valley. Outsiders who stumbled too close often carried stories back with them, stories of people who barked instead of spoke, who moved strangely through the brush like animals startled by the light. These stories traveled, half rumor and half truth, until they became something larger, folklore wrapped around living flesh. The family did not ask for this attention, but they did not resist it either. Silence was their weapon, their wall, and behind that silence the inbreeding continued, as natural to them as breathing. It is tempting to look away, to treat them like grotesque curiosities, but the reality is colder than fiction. Doctors who saw them, when they were willing to be seen, wrote about genetic deformities stacked one upon another, of jaws misaligned, of minds slowed, and speech reduced to mutters and animal-like cries. This was not a curse from some old superstition. This was science, genetics twisted by generations of the same blood folding inward. Each child born was not only a continuation of the family line, but a roll of dice weighted against them. And yet, through it all, they endured. Poverty and ridicule did not erase them. They hunted, they scavenged, they survived winters that would have killed softer men. That endurance, in a way, is what makes their story unbearable. They were strong enough to survive, but too trapped to ever escape what they had become. The outside world saw only the deformities, the strangeness, the broken speech. What it never cared to see was the suffocating isolation that had created it all. They were prisoners of geography, prisoners of shame, and prisoners of their own blood. When journalists eventually found them decades later, their shock was not just at the family's condition, but at the fact that America had allowed such conditions to persist at all. In a country that prided itself on progress and opportunity, here was a living contradiction. A family frozen in time, shaped by choices no one dared confront. Each face carried the echo of decisions made long before they were born, decisions carved into their very bones. And as the cameras clicked, the world saw what the valley had always known. This was not just a poor family. This was a family consumed by itself. When the photographs and reports finally surfaced, they spread like wildfire across the country. Newspapers framed the family as a grotesque spectacle, a carnival of shame hidden within America's own borders. Readers were horrified, but also captivated, unable to look away from the faces staring back at them from the page. It was as though the nation had discovered a mirror it wished it could smash, proof that the American dream had not lifted everyone, proof that some bloodlines had been left to rot in silence. But in those images, the family was stripped of humanity. They became an exhibit, dissected by strangers who never knew their names, only their deformities. The weight of public exposure pressed down on them like never before. Outsiders came to the valley not to help, but to gawk. Cars would slow near their shack, headlights catching pale faces peering back through broken windows. The family became a whispered destination, the kind of thing people told each other late at night. Drive far enough out, and you can see them for yourself. What had once been a private misery was now a public humiliation. Their suffering turned into a roadside attraction. And yet, for all the fascination, little was done to change their fate. Reporters left, doctors closed their notebooks, and the cameras stopped flashing. The family was left behind once more, isolated not just by geography, but by the stigma now burned into their name. Children born after the photographs carried the burden of shame they never chose, the same way they carried the twisted bloodline in their veins. For them, there was no escaping it, because the outside world had already written the story of who they were and who they always would be. In truth, the cruelty of the story is not simply the inbreeding, it is the silence that surrounded it. Neighbors who knew but said nothing, authorities who turned their bed or eyes away, generations who saw the signs and chose not to intervene. The family became a living reminder of what happens when a community abandons its own, when shame outweighs compassion, and when bloodlines are left to close in on themselves with no lifeline to the outside. They were condemned twice over, first by circumstance and then by indifference. If you've made it this far, you've already seen more than most are willing to confront, because this story does not stop at photographs or whispers. It digs into the marrow of what it means to be human when stripped of choice. Imagine being born into a world where every face around you is related, where every voice carries the same blood, where escape is not even a concept, but a fantasy that dies before it's spoken. That is what the children of this family inherited. Not just poverty, not just deformity, but a prison without walls, passed down generation after generation. The cruelty lies in how normal it became to them. For the outside world, the family was a grotesque exception, but for those inside, it was simply life. Meals were eaten on sagging porches, hunting trips were taken in the woods. Laughter, strange and guttural as it might sound, still filled the air on some evenings. In those moments, they were not monsters. They were a family like any other, trying to hold together the fragments of existence. And yet, the line between family and prison blurred so completely that escape seemed unthinkable. The bed became both cradle and coffin of their bloodline. This is where the story becomes unbearable, because there were moments, small, human moments, when one of them must have realized the truth. Perhaps it was a mother watching her child struggle to form words that would never come, or a boy noticing the way outsiders recoiled at his face. These flashes of self-awareness must have been devastating, the weight of a curse recognized too late to undo. To live in that knowledge, to know that your fate was sealed before your first breath, that is a kind of horror no fiction could ever invent. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run, knowing escape meant abandoning everyone you knew? Or would you stay, swallowing the shame and carrying it forward into the next generation? There are no easy answers here, only choices carved out of despair. And that is why this story matters. Because it forces us to face the question no one wants to ask. What happens when family, the thing meant to protect us, becomes the very thing that destroys us? The years rolled on, and with them came the slow decay of the household. Roofs caved, walls sagged, and floors sank under the weight of neglect. But the family endured inside, bound by habit and fear more than love. Outsiders who ventured too close sometimes heard sounds in the night. Low cries, strange barking noises, guttural murmurs that didn't sound fully human. To them, it was proof of the family's otherness, their separation from the rest of America. But inside those walls, those noises were not monstrosities. They were voices. Broken, yes, but still voices of sons, daughters, mothers, and fathers, trying in their own way to communicate. Researchers who dared to visit often described scenes that stayed with them for life. A child rocking in a corner, eyes wide but vacant. An older man, barefoot and filthy, who answered questions with incoherent sounds, then laughed suddenly at nothing at all. Dogs roaming freely through the rooms, their presence blurring the line between pet and kin. The smell of mildew, of sweat, of decay hung in the air like a curtain. These were not just people, they had become an ecosystem of survival where human life and animal life tangled until the difference hardly mattered. And still, the family name survived. Through births, through deaths, through ridicule and shame, the line refused to vanish. Perhaps stubbornness kept them alive. Perhaps it was a refusal to let the outside world win. But each generation carried forward the same curse, stamped into their DNA, etched into their bodies like carvings in stone. By the time officials truly tried to intervene, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The blood had been folded in on itself too many times. What unsettles most is not the deformity itself, but the realization of how thin the line is between us and them. Strip away opportunity, cut off escape, drown a family in shame and poverty, and what grows is not something alien, it is something human, just unbearably human, pushed past the edge of recognition. Their story is not just about them, it is a mirror, showing us what happens when society abandons its weakest and leaves them to consume themselves. In the end, the family was not cursed by God or punished by fate. They were abandoned, and abandonment, more than blood, was the soil in which this horror grew. There is no clean ending to this story. The bloodline still lingers, scattered across the hills and valleys, carrying fragments of what came before. Some descendants sought escape, marrying into other families, breaking the cycle one fragile step at a time. Others remained, trapped by geography and poverty, their names whispered by locals who still know the truth. But even for those who left, the past follows. You cannot outrun blood. You cannot erase what it has written into your body, your mind, your memory. Historians and journalists continue to argue about how much of the story is exaggeration, how much is myth piled onto misery, but the photographs remain, the testimony remains. The eyes in those images stare back across time, asking not for pity, but for recognition. To reduce them to monsters is to miss the deeper horror. They were not born evil, they were born forgotten. And in that forgetting, America revealed one of its cruelest truths, that progress is not a rising tide that lifts all ships. Some are left to sink quietly, their suffering too uncomfortable to acknowledge. When we talk about blood and family, we often speak with pride, heritage, roots, legacy. But in this house, blood was not pride, it was prison. Family was not protection, it was a chain. Each birth was not hope, it was the next turn of the key in a door that would never open. And still, somehow, they lived. Year after year they endured. Perhaps that is the darkest part of all, that human beings can survive in places where survival seems impossible, even if what they become on the other side is something the rest of us can barely face. So remember this family, not as freaks, not as folklore, not as entertainment for late-night whispers. Remember them as the warning they are, a warning about what happens when silence replaces compassion, when shame replaces action, when blood is left to consume itself in the dark. Because their story is not just theirs, it belongs to all of us. It is carved into the hidden chapters of American history, where the dream rots at the edges and family ties become shackles. Blood and bed, the cradle and the coffin of a name that became a curse. And once you've seen it, you will never forget it.